China has called on Zambia's other creditors to shoulder a fair burden in the country's debt restructuring after the International Monetary Fund and official creditors, including Beijing, expressed reservations about a deal Zambia struck with overseas bondholders. Now, China wants all the creditors to collaborate and participate in Zambia's debt disposal in accordance with the principle of common action and fair burden. Zambia and a bondholder committee were continuing talks, but then the official creditor committee and the IMF had voiced their doubts over the last several days and the seeming unwillingness of the creditors to agree on the modalities of the restructuring. So joining me from Lusaka, Zambia is Trevor Hambayi, Senior Managing Partner, Development Finance Associates. Trevor, it's nice to have you join us on Business Edge.
Very much, and good morning to you.
So this is the first time that China has publicly called for all the creditors to share the burden of debt restructuring in Africa. If you are to interpret China's statement, is it born out of genuine concern for Zambia or probably a sort of appeal not to be a major loser in these restructuring talks?
So the key aspect is obviously for China is that it does not want to be on the losing end once these discussions have been finalized. You will appreciate that initially when Zambia started to be able to negotiate for its debt restructuring, China was not one of the major players that was sitting there, and this delayed the negotiations until China was allowed to come and sit on the negotiating table as vice chairman of the negotiating team. But also China has got specific interest because it's the biggest bilateral lender to the African continent, as well as to the global space. And this is a key aspect for China to be able to ensure that it takes care of its interests both in the present and the future. What you do find, this issue around the conflict between the West and the East is obviously looking to Africa because of the resources that the African continent holds that will be able to speak to the global future in the next 50 to 100 years. And that is why everybody wants a bit of the pie on the African continent.
Just as you have said, Trevor, we know that China is Zambia's largest bilateral creditor. It is owed around $6 billion. China had initially been relatively reluctant to participate in any form of debt restructuring negotiations in the past, but now we're seeing it being vocal. Now, of course, Zambia is not the only African country engaging our creditors on restructuring talks like this. So if we begin to see China shed weight on all sides for these African countries, and of course you said that it could be on the losing side, and that is why it is saying that the burden should be shared. Do you think that that might in a way have adverse effects on China's economy in the long run?
So essentially, I do not think that it would have any negative impact on China's economy. There are a number of things that are speaking to this. China's economy is the largest economy there is at the moment on the global space. It's bigger than the US, is the first one. But China is also the largest exporting country on the global space. The key aspect that comes into here is that the terms and conditions that are being determined as to how Zambia restructures its debt could impact on China, because this framework would then be utilized to be universally utilized by all the African countries that are in debt distress. So it is also a very key aspect that this negotiation is not just for Zambia, but it is also going to be speaking to all the other countries that are in debt distress: Angola, Ethiopia, the Sudan. All those countries will then be working on the same terms and conditions that Zambia has restructured its debt. And this is very important for China to ensure that it mitigates this risk.
Okay, let's take it a bit further. Now, China expressed reservations about a deal Zambia struck with overseas bondholders. Why is China agitated about this? Does it have to do with the debt justice calculation that bondholders would receive more money back than official creditors? Does it have anything to do with that?
So it's exactly what you have mentioned, is that initially the bondholders were requested to be able to provide debt restructuring for their debt to the country based on the terms and conditions that were agreed by the official creditors. The one that they have proposed or are wanting to be able to propose is slightly different, and it immediately allows them to be able to get coupon payments of around $500 million. And this has been not attractive because China feels that they are getting the return on their investment immediately, but also while China will be pushing their return on their investment to another 12 to 20 years. And I think this is where the unfair issue that China is trying to be able to request that this is unfair. And I think the IMF is backing them on the same terms.
So yes, let's now leave China alone a bit and look at the other creditors. Now, the official creditor committee, actually chaired by China and France anyway, and the International Monetary Fund during talks voiced their doubts over the last several days. They are looking at the possibility of Zambia not getting out of this debt burden or situation because they've not been able to bring all the people involved to a roundtable for a consensus. So what could their doubts actually be, and why is it so challenging to get these creditors to agree to sharing the burden of debt restructuring? Hello, Trevor. Hello, Trevor, are you there? Hello, Trevor, can you hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay, did you get my question?
Yes, I got your question. So I think the doubts from the official creditors is based on the terms and conditions that the bondholders are requesting, that they're requesting to be able to get their return immediately, even though they have consolidated the bonds. Zambia had 3 bonds of a total of 3 billion. They have split them into 2, consolidated them and split them into 2. One is for 1.1 billion and the other one's for 2 billion. And then also extended the repayment to 2032 and 2053. But they're also asking for an immediate payment of around $500 million. And I think this is the contention that there is there for China as official creditors, because then they're saying this does not give Zambia the fiscal space for them to be able to recover in terms of having to restructure this debt.
Yeah.
And I think that is where the issue is coming from.
Yeah, so that now brings me to this next question, because the way it is, of course, we know that Zambia is one of the several African countries that are struggling with their levels of debt as it is. Now, the country's total debt is estimated to be around 120% of its GDP, and this debt is owed to a variety of creditors. We're talking about commercial banks, bondholders, other governments, the IMF, China, France, and all that. So amidst all these restructuring talks, to be very honest, is there any light at the end of the tunnel for Zambia?
So based on the first restructuring that we had, because really if you look at the debt, it is split into 4 different categories. The first one that we had is obviously the official creditors, which is basically the IMF, the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, the official creditors, and as well as the bilateral lenders, which is the bilateral partners in terms of countries, is the first component. That was restructured as and that is 6.3 billion. That offered the country a lot of hope because it extended the repayment period from 12 to 20 years. It also gave us country 3 years moratorium before they can actually start repaying on the principal. And this is the same principle that they had wanted to be able to use for the bondholders, which is the $3 billion bond. The other amount, then there's also another $3 billion that is owed to France as a commercial credit, to China as a commercial credit. And that was the one that China would have also restructured according to the same framework that was used by the official creditors. If we are able to achieve this, it gives the country a lot of fiscal space in terms of room to be able to get back onto the platform of having a sustainable debt, because then they have got a 3-year moratorium before they actually start to pay on the principal that would have been reduced in terms of interest rate and extended in terms of the timeline.
Okay, to wrap things up, Trevor, of course, we know that debt restructuring is a complex process. Of course, there are no easy answers to it. And there are a variety of factors that need to be considered when designing and implementing debt restructuring programs, including talks and how to appeal to these creditors to shed a bit. Now, let's look at it from the continents. Let's look at the continents. It's not only Zambia that is in these restructuring talks. South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and some other other top African countries. So if we are to look at the continent, when it comes to talks, restructuring, what are the major considerations that should be put in place for these countries to be able to meet their debt obligations and have a bit of financial buffer?
So the first thing that I do see, obviously, is that before we actually start talking about restructuring, is that African countries need to sort out their governance. All these countries have fallen into debt distress from a position of being totally viable, just because the countries have failed to be able to have fiscal discipline that is speaking to the interests of the countries. It's not that the countries do not have the resources, it's just that we have leaders who have misappropriated the resources that the countries do have. That is the first thing that we need to sort out as African countries. We cannot continue to be going back to be wanting to talk about debt restructuring, debt forgiveness, to be talking about additional grant support, because we do have the resources of our own on the African continent. And I think that is fundamentally the key issue that we all need to sort out as African countries. And then in the second place, once we have sorted this out, is then we can speak to the point of what we need to do in terms of debt restructuring that is going to ensure that we are able to repay. Because while we're talking about debt restructuring, it is not just about wanting to postpone the debt repayment. It is important that we find what it's going to take for these countries to be able to repay this debt and bring their countries into a fiscal position that is beneficial, both for development as well as for the interest of the people that they serve.
Of course, we know that Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020, and talks have been ongoing since that time up till now on how to help Zambia deal with its debt burden. We hope that, of course, the creditors, the stakeholders will be able to come to the table and agree on what is good for them, and of course Zambia to see that winners and gainers have something to smile home with, even as debts have been repaid. Trevor Hambayi, senior managing partner, Development Finance Associates, thank you so much for your time on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Now, China's call for fair burden sharing is likely to influence the discussions between Zambia and its creditors. It highlights the need for a collaborative approach that takes into account the country's economic realities and look at the growth prospects of this country. Now, it is left for the creditors to shift grounds and help Zambia find means of easing its debt burden, and we will continue to keep our eyes on that to see if Zambia will be able to get out of its financial doldrums in the coming months or years, as the case may be. Thank you so much for joining us on today's edition of Business Edge. Do not forget, you can follow us on social media. We are at New Central TV. Head on to our website, www.newcentral.africa, and equally download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. Until next time, I am Lekan Onabanjo. We'll bring you the news at the top of the hour. Don't go away.